Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Don Bullard, Fire Marshal with Woodside Fire. And we're going to talk today about the Woodside Fire's fire hazard and risk assessment that we put in for with San Mateo County Fire Safe for a grant. And Woodside Fire and San Mateo County Fire Safe applied for a CAL FIRE grant to do a comprehensive district-wide fire hazard and risk assessment. And the purpose for the assessment is to characterize the nature and extent of existing hazards. I gotta make some room here with this. 1 second. This is blocking my view.
I have to go this way. I have to go this way. Shit.
So characterize the nature and extent of existing hazards throughout the fire district, and to identify and prioritize existing high hazard area district-wide, and to identify and prioritize mitigation opportunities, and to identify and prioritize emergency response needs. It will also help to assess resource capabilities and needs, and help to pre-plan and prioritize operational response, including augmenting emergency response and resource capabilities as needed. Wildfire risk to people in homes is increasing. We all know that. There's no doubt that wildfires are getting bigger and they're occurring more frequently. While climate change and decades of fuel buildup have exacerbated wildfires, ongoing home development in wildfire-prone lands is also driving wildfire risk to communities. And the relentless tally of losses makes it increasingly clear that the U.S. is facing a deep wildfire problem. Experts warn that the destruction seen in the past 3 years, including well over 100 fatalities and 40,000 structures torched and nearly 40 billion in insured losses, is not just an anomaly, but it's also a look into our near future. If you look at this slide, you can look at 3 different time zones here. 1932 through 1999, those are acres lost in California. And then the next time frame, you'll see a much bigger piece of the pie, 2000 through 2019. And then just looking at that last section there, just a single year alone, you can see the number of acres lost. So there's no doubt wildfires are getting bigger and they're occurring more frequently. California's Strategic Fire Plan from 2018 identifies 4 main priority goals. Priority goal number 1 is to identify and evaluate wildland hazards and populations and properties and natural resources at risk. This is one of the reasons why Woodside Fire applied for a hazard and risk assessment grant. Priority number 2 is to promote local land use planning processes to protect life, property, and natural resources from wildfire risks. Goal number 3 is to develop and implement local and regional plans to mitigate wildfire hazards and emergency readiness and response plans. And then goal number 4, educate residents, landowners, and businesses about local wildfire hazards and risks, wildfire prevention measures, and wildfire safe regulations. The governor's November 2020 advisory states much of the same. Local authorities should prepare a wildfire hazard and risk assessment of existing fire hazards, projected future changes in fire hazard, severity, and populations and assets at risk to fire hazards. Consider avoiding new land uses or development in very high and high fire hazard severity zones and sites where modeling demonstrates unreasonable risk to catastrophic wildfire events. And then 3rd, consider designating very high and high fire hazard severity zones as open space or other similar land use designations to buffer against wildfire threats, together with policies and programs to mitigate the risk. So what is the definition of hazard and risk? A fire hazard, by definition through the National Fire Protection Association, is a fuel complex defined by its kind, arrangement, volume, condition, and location that determines the ease of ignition and resistance to fire control. And then the National Fire Protection Association's definition of a risk is a measure of the probability and severity of adverse effects that result from an exposure to the fire hazard. So when examining a fire hazard, the concept of complex is key. We want to let the potential interaction of fuel sources define what needs to be examined. Then look at how they might interact to expand or spread fire, and then assess the ease with which fire can intensify and spread or be contained. And then when examining fire risk, it's important to note that we don't look at the probability of an ignition or fire in the fuel complex, but rather what is the probability of adverse effects and what is the severity of those effects. What people, buildings, resources would be impacted by a fire in that fuel complex. And so these are the elements of a comprehensive fire hazard and risk assessment. Fire hazards look at fuel complexes. Would be where your fire hazards are. And we look at it in the kind and arrangement and volume, condition and location, and the ease of ignition that would occur there. And then the risks, they look at the surrounding people, buildings, and infrastructure at jeopardy if a fire occurs in that fuel complex. And then what is the probability of adverse effects from that? And what is the severity of those effects? In 2008, Ray Moritz created a hazard map that shows 19 highest hazard wildfire areas of Portola Valley. You can see them there on this map. And these are just the fire hazards. He didn't really go into the risks. That still needs to be done. That's what we're hoping to accomplish with our comprehensive fire hazard and risk assessment. But let's take a look at one section of this map and see what it can tell us.
Hey Don, this is that Casey guy. Is it possible to switch over to the mode that will make these center slides larger for people?
I'm not sure.
I don't know if you'll be able to see the notes then. People are calling it presentation mode in the chat. And there's a lot of folks asking about that. Presenter mode.
Let's see.
I'm not a Windows guy, so I don't know.
I don't use, let's see, maybe this one here.
Give it a shot, can't hurt. Now, do you still have what you need to do to see?
No, I don't.
I see what's going on. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. Maybe we try this one. That goes back to the way we can do it.
Okay, this is the way it's doing it. That's where we're going. Thank you.
Doing it. Yeah. Sorry.
Then
okay, so we're going to start with the topography. The assessment starts with the topography of the land and what it tells us about its potential impact and the intensity and expansion or spread of the fire. Right here. Yeah, this is the Escobar Canyon. And so we have two steep canyons in here. So we're looking at the topography first. That's the first layer we want to look at. Canyons have the potential for eruptive spread of fire. These are gonna kind of give you an idea of what the effects are of a canyon. Studies in Portugal and France have shown how the geometry of the canyon is critical. There's two angles that are key here. If the base of the canyon rises at an angle of 20 degrees or more, and if the side walls of the canyon also rise at an angle of 20 degrees or more, the canyon, and if the canyon has both of those features, it's almost certain to cause explosive growth depending on the fuels and weather. So you can see On the first picture on the left, that's going to be the base of the canyon, and you can see how it rises at 20 degrees. And then if you look at the next picture on the right, you're going to see the walls of the canyon. If that's greater than 20 degrees, then the canyon has both of those features. This shows you a little bit differently here. These slides illustrate the effect of different geometries on fire spread in a canyon. On the left-hand side, the base is 20 degrees, but the side walls are less than the 20 degrees. So that's going to indicate slow fire spread and no explosive growth. You can see that there's about, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's 5 to 6 dark rings on that topography map, which indicates a slow fire spread. In the middle, the base is 20 degrees and the side walls are 25 degrees. And you can note that the fire spread intensifies and speeds up in both directions. And you'll see 4 to 5 dark rings on that topography map. And then on the right side, the base is 20 degrees and the side walls are 40 degrees. And the fire spread becomes explosive. You only see 2 dark rings moving in either direction.
I had never heard of Gothic landscape. No.
Next, we look at fuel complex layers on top of our topography in terms of vegetative fuels. What kind, arrangement, volume, condition, location, and what's the ease of ignition that exists within that complex. So there's the canyon there on top with the vegetative fuels. There's another canyon there with the vegetative fuels. And then finally, we add the layer of fuel from the built environment, housing and infrastructure. What are the risks? We look at the surrounding people, buildings, and infrastructure at jeopardy if a fire occurs in that fuel complex. And then what is the probability of the adverse effects? And what is the severity of those effects? Understanding these hazards and the risks that they create is critical. And that's why Woodside Fire, along with Fire Safe, applied for the comprehensive fire hazard and a risk assessment for our grant. So this is the process that we're hoping to utilize to better understand and prioritize these risks and these hazards throughout the fire district. So I don't know, Denise, if you want to just wait for questions at the end after Rusty's done with his, or if we want to take questions now.
Well, we can do it either way. I think we'll just go through to through Rusty's presentation.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Very good.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I've got a screen up. You should all be able to see it. The title of this presentation is Why is California Burning? And it picks up on where Don started. Let me put this in presentation mode if I can. All right, there we go. So Don began with a really powerful graphic from Cal Fire that came out this year. It's probably one of the best compilations of data that I've seen in a long time because it graphically conveys the momentum and power with which some very complex circumstances in California are occurring. And the rapid increase in the size and growth of fires in California really prompts a question of why is this happening? What is it that's causing it? Obviously, there are obvious reasons. Well, it's drier, it's hotter, there's less rain. But do we really understand what's causing this to happen? And to get a sense of the magnitude of what's going on right now, this is a satellite photo taken a week ago of Northern California. And you'll see in white the outline of the state. On the left, we've got the Pacific Ocean. To the north, to the top, you see Oregon. To the right is Nevada. These were the fires that were burning on August 5th in California. Let's just take a look at some of them. There's the Dixie Fire, northeast of Chico, just above Paradise. That fire has today consumed over 490,000 acres. It's only 27% contained. It's been burning for 3.5 weeks. It's the second largest fire in California's history. It's already burned over 765 square miles. All of San Mateo County is 744 square miles. So the Dixie Fire has already burned all of San Mateo County. And if you want to throw it in, most of San Francisco for good measure. To the right of the Dixie Fire is the Beckworth Fire. You can see these two images of flame just to the lower right of the Dixie Fire. That fire is now about 98% contained. But before it was contained, it burned over 100,000 acres. Then we've got the Monument Fire. That's burning east of Eureka. It's a Forest Service fire. Nearly 60,000 acres are burning, and today it's only 3% contained. Then we've got the Antelope Fire, northeast of Shasta. It's another Forest Service fire. That's burned 44,000 acres, and today it's 24% contained. And then we've got the McFarland Fire outside of Redding. That's in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. It's another Forest Service fire. It's got destroyed 35,000 acres so far, and it's 47% contained. So as Don said, there's no doubt that wildfires are increasing. But why? What's causing this? Well, at the root of this is the atmosphere is running a fever. You know, we talk about temperature, we talk about temperature increase, but what's really going on, that kind of misses the point. What's really going on is there's a relentless and increasing buildup of heat in the lower atmosphere. We commonly refer to it as temperature, but that misses the point. The lower atmosphere is accumulating heat energy, more heat energy than at any time in the past 100,000 years. It's running a fever. And the fact that it's running a fever should be a very stark and sobering message to us. That buildup of heat energy is causing the atmosphere and the earth to respond in previously unseen ways as it tries to deal with this excess accumulating energy. And how the atmosphere and the earth respond to that heat accumulation, what happens as a result, is going to be very important to watch. It's not dissimilar to what happens in a fire. When you have an accumulation of heat energy that runs out of control. And in many ways, we're watching the very early stages of the environment's response to this excessive and unwanted heat. We don't have any experience of how it's going to deal with it. We don't know what it's going to do. One of the things that's happening with this increase in heat energy is there's an increasing rate of evaporation. And that increasing rate of evaporation is increasingly drying our vegetative, but not just our vegetative, also our built environment. Fuel moistures are at very, very low levels. They're at low levels much earlier than ever before. And that's true for structures as well as for plants. If anything, wooden structures, any built structure, any artificial structure that holds moisture is even more affected because they don't have a vascular system or sclerosis leaves like oak has to protect them. They simply dry out. Increasing temperatures also expand the atmosphere's capacity to hold and its demand for water vapor. This is a very important phenomenon to understand. it's not just that more vapor is being expunged from sources of moisture on the earth. It's that the atmosphere's demand for vapor is increasing. As temperatures rise and evaporation increases, so too does the atmosphere's demand for even more water vapor. With each 20-degree increase in temperature, the atmosphere's demand for water vapor doubles. Now just think what that means. When temperatures go from 70 degrees to 90 degrees, the atmosphere's demand for water vapor increases by 100%. And when temperatures go from 90 degrees to 110 degrees, its demand for water vapor doubles again. And when its demand for water vapor exceeds the Earth's supply of that vapor through evaporation, when the demand is so great that the capacity to fill it doesn't fill it, you get a deficit, a vapor pressure deficit. You remember we used to argue about the budget deficits. Well, in California, that deficit is a vapor deficit, and it's been increasing for decades, and now it's getting extreme. We're supplying less water vapor to the atmosphere than it demands, and that causes the atmosphere to soak up moisture wherever it can get it. Our climate is becoming, as a result, more and more arid, and all of the moisture-bearing sources are drying out and desiccating as a result. This hasn't been going on for a few years, 10 years, 20 years. This has been going on for 60 years. And it's getting worse. As the vapor pressure deficit increases, as the atmospheric sponge soaks up more and more moisture out of the earth, the size and scale of wildfires in Northern California. Now, we're looking here at the northern coastal area of California and the Sierra Nevada. This is the area that used to get fairly good rain. But what we see happening is, as the vapor pressure deficit increases, there's a stark correlation between the increasing magnitude of vapor pressure deficit, which is shown here on the horizontal x-axis, and the increasing size of Northern California's wildfires, which is shown here on the y-axis.
Yeah, it seems like we should be able to just like link.
So the blue dots represent periods before 2000. Those are fires that occurred before 2000. And the orange dots are fires that have occurred after 2000 up to 2018. This chart only depicts that correlation through 2018. But from that time forward, it's gotten dramatically worse. It has actually followed the curve depicted on this map. It has grown enormously. One of the other consequences of a buildup of heat in the atmosphere are Diablo winds. People say, well, we don't get Diablo winds on the peninsula. And I say, have you been watching the buildup of winds lately? Did you stand outside this spring or last fall? But the question really isn't about the winds. There are two critical points to be made about what's happening here. The heat buildup in the atmosphere, it's the heat buildup in our lower atmosphere that creates the conditions that cause Diablo winds to occur. Very hot accumulation of heat energy creates masses of hot air over the Great Basin. Those masses of hot air force cooling air down to subside rapidly, picking up heat and picking up pressure. And as those air masses descend, gathering heat, gathering pressure, they move towards the easiest outlet, And the easiest outlet is the low pressure area over the coast. You have a high pressure in the Great Basin, hot, high pressure air. You've got low pressure, cool air over the ocean. And what that does increasingly is push masses of hot, high pressure air to the ocean, to the coast. As those conditions occur more frequently and experience more frequent and stronger events that push the marine layer off the coast and out to sea. This phenomenon is increasing, it's not diminishing, and we will increasingly lose the natural ventilator and moisturizer all along the coast that's been here for centuries and kept us a relatively moist climate. That is dissipating. And that will lead to an even drier, more hazardous environment for fire. Now, it's not just that the size of fires is increasing, but the destructiveness of fires is also increasing. After years of indifference and ignorance on my part, the Tubbs fire in 2017 was for me a real wake-up call. In less than 12 hours, a fire burned over 20 miles to destroy nearly 5,000 homes. The destruction that we are seeing in the fires that are occurring is increasing enormously. This is CAL FIRE's current listing of the 20 most destructive fires in California's history. 15 of these fires, all of these, have occurred since 2015. 7 in 2020 and 2020 alone, and this year is only just getting started. If you're able to see the resolution of this, and perhaps you can't, you'll notice that the destruction is occurring primarily in September, October, and November. 14 of the 20 most destructive fires on this chart occurred in September and later. Now, go back. I want to focus on 3 of these fires: the Camp Fire, the Tubbs Fire, and the Oakland Hills or Tunnel Fire. They're separated by 30 years, roughly. The Oakland Fire, when it occurred in 1991, seemed to be, certainly struck me as a one-off, a random, rare, freak event, not likely to reoccur. But then the Tubbs Fire occurred in 2017, and I really took note. When fire burned through Coffee Park and Fountain Grove, destroying almost every home, many of which had been built to Chapter 7A standards and had implemented neighborhood-wide defensible space and vegetative removal programs. And yet they were destroyed within hours. I couldn't help but pay attention. And then a year later, the campfires came. And within 24 hours, over 18,000 structures, 13,000 single-family homes were destroyed. So what's causing that? Is that just a buildup of heat in our atmosphere, or is something else causing that? In Paradise, this is CAL FIRE's map of the destruction that occurred in Paradise. On the left, you have a large-scale depiction. You can see Chico to the left. You can see in the red outline the full perimeter of the fire. The red is a reflection of structures or buildings destroyed. The black are buildings or structures where there was no visible damage. And the green are structures that were affected. You can zoom in on this map and you can look at the areas of red in high resolution and detail. And when you zoom in and you look at the destruction that occurred within the neighborhoods in Paradise, you see that in almost all of the neighborhoods, the destruction was complete. Nothing was spared. Everything burned. And so what's causing this? What causes thousands of homes to be destroyed so quickly and thoroughly? What causes entire neighborhoods to be burned out in a matter of hours, perhaps even minutes in some cases? At one level, the answer is obvious. Obviously, it was fire. And fire can be ferocious, and we all know that, especially in high winds with plenty of fuels. But is that all it was? Wind and fuels? Or is something else important going on here? Something we really need to pay attention to as the climate changes, as fires grow larger, occur more frequently, and burn into our residential neighborhoods. I've been looking into that for over a year, and I want to share with you some of what I found so far. And I have to start by saying that it seems to me that very few people are really looking at this. I've asked and contacted people all over the country to find out what they can tell us about this. The most thorough examination seems to be one being performed by the National Institute of Standards. Alex Marangides is running it. It's a three-part study. The first part was released in February. There are two parts that remain. One on evacuation, and the second one on the pathways that caused this level of destruction. I'm very interested in both, but they won't be out for years to come. And I don't know if I can wait. So I keep asking questions to find out, well, what explains this? And here are some of the pieces of the puzzle I want to share with you that I've discovered and some thoughts about what they show. First of all, start at the bottom with the basics. How does heat propagate? How does heat move? Well, three major sources: conduction, convection, radiation. Conduction, we all know, is you touch it, it's hot. It moves by direct contact. It's the transfer of heat energy from one material to another through direct contact of excited molecules touching the surface of the unheated molecules and heating them up. Convection, well, moves by wind, fluid dynamics, fluid motion, blows the heated molecules across an unheated surface. And as those molecules, heated molecules, cross that surface, make contact with the surface, they heat that surface up. The third way in which heat propagates is by radiation. Now, that's not heated molecules. That is electromagnetic radiation emitted by a fire in all directions as light energy at a very high intensity. Those three forces, those three mechanisms, are the way by which fire transfers the heat from a fire to surrounding areas. Conduction, you've got to be in direct contact with it. Convection, well, you could be many meters, perhaps even a kilometer away, and be affected by the convection, the fluid dynamic flow of heated air from a fire over your surface. Radiation depends on your proximity and orientation to the fire. If you get close enough, you're going to be exposed. I'm going to focus on radiation in this talk because I think it may be the hidden culprit that we need to understand and look at closely, much more closely than we have. First of all, radiation is emitted by a fire, thermal radiation, across the infrared, visible, and ultraviolet spectrum. So much of it is in the infrared spectrum. All of it, or all of the visible spectrum, is affected. And the upper levels of the ultraviolet spectrum also are affected in a fire and emit radiation. As the temperature of a fire increases, the spectrum of radiation emitted by the fire changes. And so what you see here on the x-axis is the wavelength of radiation. And what you're seeing from 1 out 2, 3, 4, that's the infrared spectrum. And then when you get down closer to 0, you begin to see the visible spectrum, and then you begin to see the ultraviolet spectrum. The point I want to make here is that as the temperature of the fire increases, as it goes from 1200 kelvins, which is about 900 degrees centigrade, to 1600 kelvins, which would be about 1300 degrees centigrade, to 2000 kelvins, which would be about 1700 degrees centigrade, the spectrum and the level of emissions, the spectrum changes and the level of emissions increase dramatically. So as the intensity of the fire increases, as the temperature of the fire increases, the spectrum shifts to the left, to the ultraviolet end of the spectrum, and it increases enormously. One of the unexplored implications of a shift to the ultraviolet is the penetrative effect. As the wavelengths shift to the ultraviolet, the wavelength shortens, it becomes ever smaller, and it becomes more penetrative. That means that more of it is absorbed, but some of it actually penetrates the surfaces that are exposed to it. So what is radiant flux, and how does it relate to temperature? Well, the important thing to understand about the intensity of radiant flux, it's measured in terms of kilowatt hours per meter squared. It's a measure of the amount of energy, kilowatts, thousands of watts, falling on a meter squared. And that flux occurs over a period of time. These measurements are simply an instant in time. So we're looking at a surface whose temperature ranges from a little above 0 to 800 degrees centigrade. And you can see that there is a dramatic increase over that temperature range in the magnitude of radiant flux emitted by that surface. Why is it increasing like that? Because the emission of electromagnetic radiation is related to the temperature of the fire by a power of 4. If you double the temperature of a fire, you increase the amount of radiation 16 times. If you drop the temperature by half, you reduce the radiation by 4. So increases in temperature, fires that burn very hot, very intensely, release enormous amounts of radiation. You notice this chart ends at 800. And that's because for all my looking and all the work I've done to try and get answers to those questions, nobody is looking out here. Nobody's looking out in the upper ranges of temperature to measure what is the radiant flux generated by these fires, and for good reason. You can't get close enough. And experimental conditions are too dangerous to reproduce in a lab. And so the truth is, right now, we simply don't know what the radiant flux is when temperatures get to 900 or 1000 degrees centigrade or 1500 degrees centigrade, as was measured in the Tubbs fire. We just don't know. But we do know that exposure to radiant flux is very dangerous. So on the left is a chart showing the level of exposure for second-degree burns. If you're exposed for, on the x-axis, 1 minute to a fire that's generating a 4 kilowatt per meter squared flux, you will suffer second-degree burns. If you're exposed to a 10 kilowatt flux, it takes 20 seconds to develop second-degree burns. But this scale is at the very bottom of the scale of radiant flux we're looking at. We haven't begun to understand or explore the correlation between high temperature, radiant flux, and the effects it has. Now, there's some experiments that are just getting started, but Cal Fire is sponsoring. National Institute of Standards is involved. The Insurance Bureau in South Carolina is involved. Others are involved as well, to look at what radiant flux from 3 different types of fires might be. And they're taking this is going to take 4 years. So we're not going to have answers soon. But what they're doing is they are beginning small at the bottom, as we started here. They're beginning it with fires of sheds, small sheds. And they are looking at the flux that's generated, the radiant flux, the heat flux that's generated by a small shed placed 20 feet away from a structure. They're measuring the flux that's generated at the eaves, depicted here in the blue curve, and at the upper wall of a target structure, a structure 20 feet away from the shed. They're lighting the shed on fire and seeing what flux are we generating. Now, what we have depicted here, these experiments have just started, and we don't have any of the results yet. I'll talk about that in just a second. So what we have here is we have a computer model. We have a model that they've developed to project or predict what the flux will be. They predict that if you have a shed burning 20 feet away from a structure, it will generate a flux at the eaves that is 70 kilowatts per meter squared. It will take 20 kilowatts per meter squared to ignite the structure. They're projecting a flux that is 50 kilowatts greater than the flux required to ignite the adjacent structure. The red projection shows what the flux would be at the top of the walls, about 58, 57 kilowatts, or 37 kilowatts greater than the ignition temperature projected for the structure. So as I said, these are just projections. You see here, this dotted line across the bottom is the critical flux, 20 kilowatts per meter squared, and you can see what these structure fires, these sheds 20 feet away from the structure, what kind of flux they generate. The plan is, after they've done these shed experiments, to take the data and figure out, okay, what do we do with this in terms of the next phase? How do we look at the next largest structure we're going to look at? The next largest structure in their plan is what they call an in-law unit or an ADU, but it's only 400 square feet. They need these results in order to determine and calculate what the appropriate parameters are for actually trying to test this under controlled conditions so they don't burn down their laboratory. Once they figure that out, they hopefully will run the experiments, and then they will take that data and use it to do the same thing for the next larger scale experiments, where they plan to look at what they call a residential unit adjacent to the structure they're looking at. But that residential unit is going to be 1,000 square feet. So understand that even in these controlled experiments, what we're looking at is we're looking at structures whose enthalpy, whose capacity to produce heat is much less than the structures that actually exist on our landscape. And yet, look, these are the projections. We'll get the results in time. I said I'd talk a little bit more about this. The fellow running these experiments for NIST, National Institute of Standards, is Alex Marangides. I've been dealing or talking with Alex for some time now, and I've invited him to come to FireSafe San Mateo and speak, and he's interested in doing that, and hopefully we can get him here at the end of the year, when he thinks he will have some preliminary results from the shed experiments that he can share. So Denise and I and Don and others are trying to get that arranged. Alex is very eager to get this information out because it's very important for people to see and understand what this is and what the implications of it are. Well, until we have those experiments, what do we know? And what can we infer? How do we begin to grapple with this situation? We know that the separation distance from flux, from the source of radiant emissions, is very important. These are assumptions. There are no measurements. This is not this is an illustration. We're waiting for the measurements to come in because no one has done the experiments. But let's assume that you are standing 50 feet away from a fire, and that fire is generating where you're standing a flux of 20 kilowatts per meter squared. That's your exposure at 50 feet. So what happens if you move from 50 feet to 100 feet? Well, the flux reduces by the inverse square of the distance. In other words, the flux drops when you add 50 feet of separation distance by a fourth to 5 kilowatts per meter squared. Well, you're still going to get second degree burns, but that's a hell of a lot better than 20 kilowatts. Now, what happens if you move closer to the fire? Let's say instead of 50 feet, let's say you go to 25 feet. What happens then? Oh, wrong arrow. If you go to 25 feet, the flux also increases by the inverse of the distance squared from 20 to 80. It's a fourfold increase in flux. But that's if it's a point source. That's if the radiation is coming from a single source, which, let me go back. The geometry between the area that is emitting fire and the exposed person is such that the emission appears to be a point source. It's narrow and it's confined. But what if the emission is from a large area? What if the emission is from a 20 by 40 foot wall? What if that entire wall is burning and emitting radiation? What's the flux then? And what separation distance is safe? Well, two things to understand. First of all, when the emission comes from a large area, it no longer diminishes by the inverse of the square of the distance. Rather, until this becomes a point source relative to the exposure, until this area becomes so small in perspective relative to where you're standing and your exposure that it's a point source, the radiant flux will vary directly. There will be no reduction in flux until you get at least as far away as the furthest length of the area. In this case, no reduction in flux until you get 40 feet away from that wall. When you get 40 feet away from that wall, the flux will begin to diminish, but it will not diminish to the point of an inverse squared relationship until it becomes a point source relative to your perspective. Has anybody looked at this or done the measurements on this? No. We just don't know. Another aspect of radiant flux is how it varies with exposure, the geometry of exposure. Here you've got a point source, and here you've got a surface. In the middle, that single surface, that plane, is directly exposed. The totality of it is exposed, and all of that surface is going to be radiated. all of that surface is going to accumulate and aggregate electromagnetic radiation. And so the level of exposure, by comparison in the extreme case to the example on the right, is maximal in the middle, minimal on the right. If you turn that surface so that just the edge of the surface is facing the fire, then you get the least amount of exposure. If you've got a square and you turn the square so that it's kitty corner, you also diminish the exposure that the square receives by comparison to the parallel wall. You have more exposure than the minimal exposure on the right, but you have less exposure than the parallel wall on the left. How much? How does it differ? We don't know. This is another aspect of thermal radiation, radiant flux, that's very important and not commonly understood. There's a very common laboratory experiment done in chemistry to illustrate, or physics, to illustrate this phenomenon. You take a Bunsen burner, you put it next to a slab, and depending upon the area of this slab, you apply heat. The percentage of heat that's applied is related to the area of the slab. The greater the area of the slab to the area of the heat source, the more heat is dissipated off of the surface, released through radiation and convective flow off the surface, and the surface will not ignite. The heat radiates off the surface, it cools. And even though there's a heat source, this material is radiating that heat away. Convection is cooling the material and the surface won't burn. You have to significantly increase the flame to get this surface to ignite. But what happens if you take that same Bunsen burner, you take that same slab, and you put a slab next to it? Now they both flame, and they flame enormously. Why? Because both surfaces are radiating the heat energy received from that flame off to the other surface, and both are re-radiating that energy back between them. There's a feedback effect between the two surfaces that concentrates and increases the heat energy. Now, this is just exactly what you saw Don talk about earlier. This is what happens in a canyon. When the canyon walls are, the angle of incline in the canyon walls is increased, they begin to radiate heat. They begin to act like a furnace. And that feedback effect concentrates and intensifies the heat energy between the two surfaces, causing explosive growth of fire. Same thing happens in a built environment. If you increase the flame on the first experiment in the single wall and you succeed in getting it burned, but then you take the Bunsen burner away, the flame goes out because the surface is able to radiate the heat away and convection helps cool it. But if you ignite the two surfaces and take the flame away, the fire doesn't go out. The feedback effect continues. And so what you see is you've got in this illustration of that experiment, when you put two surfaces side by side facing each other, they both radiate against each other and they create a feedback effect between them. So what's the implication of that for alignment and distancing of structures? Does this have significance for how we design and build our neighborhoods and our communities in California? Well, if you align the structures as on the left with two parallel walls directly facing each other side by side, you maximize the potential for radiant feedback between them. If, however, you separate the structures by at least the distance of the longest dimension of the structure, of the potentially radiating surface, and you turn a kitty corner or in some other oblique angle to it, you diminish, not necessarily minimize, but you diminish the exposure to radiant flux from that structure. So the example on the left maximizes the exposure to radiant flux. The example on the right, while it doesn't minimize it, it dissipates it. There's one other thing that the alignment on the left does. It also affects convective flow. When you align two surfaces like this, just like a canyon, and you experience a heat source, that heat source is going to create a convective flow upwards. The energy is going to flow upwards, and it's going to suck and draw cold, fire-feeding air in from both sides to further the flames, to increase the combustion. And you'll get a continual flow of air to the combustion and up and away from the combustion in an intensifying temperature. So what's this mean for neighborhoods? Well, the first thing it means is that once built, future exposures are fixed. When we build a building, we place a long time bet on how that building and the ones around it are going to affect and expose each other to fire hazard. Radiant doses are cumulative and aggregative. That means that not only is the exposure fixed, but that structure is fixed in time. It ain't going anywhere when a fire occurs. It's going to sit there and accumulate radiant energy from every source around it that's radiating. Radiant energy is a two-way street. That means that heat receiving surfaces also emit radiation. They don't just receive the radiation. As their temperature increases, as they absorb that radiation, they re-radiate that radiation back. And that's why the alignment and positioning of those surfaces relative to one another is so important. Separation distances and spatial alignments are critical. Radiation both cools emitting surfaces and it heats receiving surfaces. The separation distance, the spatial orientation, and the alignment of those surfaces all affects their exposure and their total aggregate dose in any fire. And so the last point on this that I want to make, and I think this is an important and well, it's an important concept we need to grapple with. Defensible space is a two-way street. It's not just about building a moat around my home. It's about also giving my home the means to breathe, to release energy in a safe way that doesn't ignite the fuel sources around it, that doesn't ignite my neighbor's home or my tree. Last point I want to make is that it's clear much more investigation is needed. And it's kind of surprising. Here we are in California. Here we are we like to think we're the epicenter of the world, but we certainly think we're the epicenter of the technology revolution. And we don't know how to design our neighborhoods. Engineering firms employ thousands of engineers. They spend billions of dollars annually to anticipate and protect their products against the effects of radiant heat. We've all had the experience of our iPhones heating up in our pockets. How much time, energy, and initiative investment do you think Apple's putting in reducing that heat, designing that phone so it doesn't burn up in your pocket? We've got to learn and apply the necessary lessons. for the safe design and prudent development of our neighborhoods and communities. We need to understand how heat is at the bottom, the source of our problems, and how we can safely dissipate it, not enhance and intensify it. Thank you. That's it. So I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, thank you, Rusty. Thank you, Dawn. I'm going to go through the chat and we have some time for questions. So let me go back here. Okay, I'm going back. Dawn, this is during your presentation. This is from Casey. And Casey's question is, does the risk factor, so he's talking about your assessment, risk assessment, does it include damage costs to private property?
Yes. Damage costs of private property, yes. Yes. it would.
So when we do the risk assessment, the one thing that we haven't entertained, because we'll definitely need help from the county or the towns, is if we do the risk assessment map and we know all the areas that are at the highest risk, and if we lose those areas to wildfire and the neighborhood is destroyed, we don't know exactly, or we haven't analyzed what the financial issue would be in terms of loss of, property tax revenue and things like that for the town and all the entities, the schools, fire district. So I was thinking that that would be an appropriate analysis to put in a risk assessment map. It's kind of like the hazard mitigation plan that the county is doing right now, maybe to add that.
Oh, that's the loss of infrastructure part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, loss of infrastructure and loss of housing, and what kind of financial impact that has. Those people are displaced, and I think it's a good analysis. I'm not sure who could do that for us, but it might be worth including it.
And recovery costs too.
Recovery costs. They might have some, we might be able to pull up some from Sonoma. The CZU fire is probably just putting that together. So we'll have some from Santa Cruz County and maybe a little bit from San Mateo County.
I mean, we would have to look farther back in time in history, going back to, like maybe the witch fire or, something way back in time, because these current fires that have happened, the Tubbs fire and the Campfire, they're not done yet. They're still recovering. They
Right,
don't
right.
know
No,
what those total costs are. yet,
right.
Because
No.
they're still in the process.
Right, exactly. Okay, this question is for Rusty. This is from Nikki Hansen. Are we also losing water that is escaping beyond the atmosphere? For example, is there any water vapor that is leaving permanently, which cannot be recycled? Or is the water vapor being concentrated into smaller regions so that some areas which are wetter than usual and some areas which are much drier than usual in that water vapor deficit mode? So I guess she's asking, is the water vapor being attracted to where there's other water vapor? And so does that help dry the drier areas?
Well,
Sorry if it was really confusing.
Yeah.
That's Nikki. Yeah, I guess I was just trying to ask, are we going to see this problem become worse and worse, partly because of, the feedback loop that we're in and climate change, but also partly because we're actually losing water completely? Like, is the atmosphere overheating and then what certain amount of water is totally escaping? And so then given, over time, thousands of years, would we actually get, this is kind of, I don't know, this is kind of a macro question, but would we actually have less total water on the planet? I mean, does anyone know, like, have we reached sort of a tipping point where we're going to eventually head in the direction of some of the other planets we've looked at, where we suspect they used to have lots of water and then over time they reached some kind of yeah, anyway, if you understand it, go for it.
Well,
answer.
I think I certainly understand the question. That's a great question. I don't have a
Great, thank you.
mind large enough or broad enough to comprehend the variables that would have to be considered to answer the question. I don't know if anybody has looked at that. The point
Oh, it
wanna-
looks like.
the point I want to
Casey-
focus on is
Right.
that the atmosphere, the world is a very big place. The atmosphere is a very, very complex, ongoing chemical reaction where gases are moving and exchanging heat energy over the surface of the earth in all kinds of ways. What's happening here, just in our local climate, what's happening is we're creating a set of conditions that is altering the climate that we live and experience and turning us to a much more arid, predictably arid climate that is desiccating the land on which we live. That is what's happening here. So if you allow me to compress my focus to a much more manageable subset than the macro question you've asked, I don't know the answer to the macro question. I don't think anybody does, but at a small subset, what is happening here is we have set ourselves up for decades to come of an increasingly arid climate. And we need to recognize and adapt to that and do what we can to adjust and compensate for it.
All right, it is a very complicated and sophisticated issue. Kevin from PG&E, he wrote in the chat that there's Dr. Stephen Pine and has been writing on this subject for some decades. And he calls it the Pyrocene, the Age of Fire. So I can post that on the website or send it out in email. So he might be somebody who we could check into and maybe even have us come back and present.
Great.
Okay, let's see here. MJ Lee, seems like these diagrams could be used to explain why the 30 feet and 100 feet distances are good for defensible space. For those residents who want a physics-based explanation. Rusty, Don, what do you guys feel about that?
Well, if you want to see all the diagrams, they're in the book I'm publishing. So yeah, the purpose of the book is to try and make public some of this information in ways that are intelligible and explicable for everybody, so that we can look at and understand this. And I think that insofar as Denise or Don or anybody else wants to use them to help teach and educate people, I'm all for it. That's what this is about.
Well, I think Jack Cohen, back in the day, he did his forest experiment. And when he had houses and then he had a real wildfire. And I believe that's where the 30 and the 100 foot distances came from. Don, is that?
Yes,
Is that correct?
correct. That is
Yeah.
correct.
So he used your radiant heat theory. He had all these test cabins. It was a crown fire. And he has published, I mean, he was the father of defensible space and, distancing. So it'd be good to go back and just kind of look at what he did. But the 30 and the 100 foot, they hold
So Denise,
strong.
not to belabor that point, but I go into his experiments in the book.
Okay.
And yes, he did partial experiments, but they've never been followed up. The implications of his experiments are very disturbing and have never been explored. And that's what now is starting to happen with the experiments that CAL FIRE and NIST are doing. So it's 20 years later and we're starting to get the experiments, but
He never
there's
went
much-
into that blue box area.
yeah, he never,
800 degrees.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
well, why don't you, go ahead.
Yeah, what happened with his experiments is he never They never made it into, if you remember the diagram that Rusty showed with the blue box, nobody's gone into that realm up there to experiment what goes on up there. They never were able to make it above 800 degrees and experiment as to what goes on up in that unknown area. And so that's what needs to happen at this point in time. You know, vegetative fuels burn hot for a very short period of time, but the built environment burns hot for long periods of time and generates much higher heat.
Right. I want to say that NIST was looking for and wanted to get permission when there is a wildfire. They wanted to place their cameras and recording devices in the path of the fire so that they could get some recordings. And I remember hearing and seeing that about 5 years back. I'm not sure if they've been allowed to do that or not, but that might be some of the data that's going to come out of NIST in the pathways to destruction research you talked about, Rusty.
Yeah. And unfortunately, they didn't have cameras at Paradise when it burned.
Right. Yeah. Or Coffee Park, right?
Yeah,
Which
right.
is a very good example of a suburban neighborhood, you know, house next to house, which have those little boxes in between the houses. You know, obviously there was wind that helped drive the fire, but that example, Rusty, that you have, the radiation, the penetrating radiation, I think is very surreal. And yeah, and I just want to say, you know, wood combusts at a 250 to 300 Celsius. That's the auto ignition of wood. That's fairly low.
Right.
Okay, let's keep. Kevin from PG&E has another link for us. He says one very stark example of excellent planning, as expressed by Rusty, is a kqed.org. Anyway, it's this California neighborhood was built to survive a wildfire, and it worked. So we have that link in the chat that we can also send out. I don't think I've seen
It's
that
the
one.
Rancho Santa Fe witch fire
Okay.
with the work that their fire marshal did down there, which
Okay.
was really great. I'm excited, Rusty, for you. The interest your book will do, and wondering about your ideas about water vapor and why we're seeing so many plume-dominated collapse with boundary outflows. They've had a dozen of them on the Dixie Fire now, and it used to be a once a summer or a couple times a summer event as well.
I'd love to follow up with you, Kevin, on that.
Okay, I'm going through the chat. Let's see here. Okay, I have some questions maybe Casey, I'll have you go through the chat when I go through my questions. So Dawn, I have a question for you. So you outlined very, very well topography and how these canyons, they used to be called box canyons. They probably have more sophisticated names nowadays, but a box canyon is really, I think, a good description. Can you go into a little bit about also aspect and, like, for example, like the southern exposure aspect of a box canyon or any canyon?
Yeah, so the aspect, depending, aspect of any ridge or, surface pertains to the direction that it faces, right? And so anything that faces to the south is going to get more sun exposure, and it's going to, due to that, it's going to get more heat, and it's going to dry out those fuels much quicker than, say, a north exposure, okay? And so anytime you have a canyon that faces in a south or southwest, those are your two critical aspects. Anytime you have a canyon that faces that direction, like I said, it's going to get more heat throughout the day for a longer period of time, and those fuels are going to dry out. And so that makes those canyons that have those aspects much more dangerous.
And I just want to state, we have those kinds of canyons all over San Mateo County. I'm looking at one right now in Palomar Park. We have them in Belmont, San Juan Canyon, Water Dog Lake, Devonshire in San Carlos, Vista Park in San Carlos, Crestmore Canyon in San Bruno. I mean, they're everywhere, absolutely everywhere.
Denise, one other point, just to add on to what Don said. The reason that aspect matters so much, the exposure, the heat that ground is getting, that the surface is getting, is radiant energy. It's electromagnetic radiation from the sun. And it is exposed all day long. And so the reason the southern exposure is so important is because the length of exposure and the angle of exposure results in a higher exposure to the radiant energy than other surfaces. If you're facing north, you get less exposure. If you're facing west when the sun is rising, you get less exposure. If you're facing south, you get exposure from the sun all day long, and the dosage is cumulative, it builds up. And that's why on the ground surface, in mid-afternoon, not midday, mid-afternoon, when you get the peak load, the peak dosage has accrued and accumulated around 3, 4, 5 o'clock. Temperatures on the ground can be 170 degrees on the ground surface. And you said, wood ignites, you can get auto combustion of wood, at 250 Celsius. So imagine this is how much heating is going on that surface. That the surface is at 170. Now I'm talking Fahrenheit, not Celsius. So we're comparing apples and oranges, but it's still the point that that aspect is very important, critical.
Anybody who's ever worked in a Cal Fire station at the peak of fire season knows that around 4 o'clock, when those tones start going off, that's the reason why. They start going off around 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right. So, Don, I think another presentation that might be good to try to have in FireSafe is how do we actually do fuel reduction on the sides of those box canyons, which are usually, very steep. And where is it better to do something on the bottom of the canyon or focus on the sides? They're difficult canyons to treat. I'm not sure what your take is on that.
So I'll start off with this and then I'll pass it off to Rusty because we had a discussion about this. And there's a phenomena that goes along with that, that they've done studies on. But yes, ideally you want to start off with the underbrush and clear that underbrush up to about 6 feet, leaving islands of vegetation in there for habitat. But really what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep any kind of a surface fire from getting into the crowns of those trees and the vegetation along that canyon. With that being said, there's also a phenomena that Rusty can explain with the wind and that those trees actually help the situation.
Yeah, this is, again, you're touching on areas of a lot of unknowns. This is yet to be determined. But most of the real, I think, significant work on canyons has been done in Europe, in the Mediterranean countries, Spain and France, have really looked hard at the behavior of fire in canyons. And what they're finding, and this is part of I think what's so important about what Don is talking about and illustrating is that you don't need a box canyon. You need two slopes. You need the sidewalls and you need the base of the canyon. Those two geometric determinants are really what count. Then on fuels, if the fuels are lightly lignous fuels, if you have grasses or light brush, that is when you get the most explosive conditions. And why is that? Because a denser canopy of trees and managed vegetation acts as a windbreak. It actually increases the viscosity of airflow over the surface, and you get a slower and less explosive convective flow over that surface. So you actually retard the progress of a fire based on vegetation that can slow the wind speed down. If you remove that vegetation, there's no impediment to the wind speed, and then you get very explosive convective flows up the slope. So, you know, again, a lot of work remains to be done to figure this out and to develop what are, you know, reliably prudent and safe practices. We don't know.
But a good
Yeah.
place to start is with the surface fuels and to reduce that underbrush up to about 6 to 8 feet.
And the grass, keep the grass down.
Right, well, those are surface fuels, keeping the grass down and clearing that underbrush so that it doesn't have the surface fuels don't have the capability or the potential of getting up into the canopy.
Yeah, I agree that the winds, with Rusty's presentation, that the winds have dramatically increased. I mean, I've noticed, I think we've all noticed that. And I just want to remind everybody that with extra wind or increased wind, wind also dries out our vegetative fuels.
Mhm.
So our fuels are even drier than they would be under our terrible conditions we have now, but the wind actually exacerbates it. And when you do have a small ignition and you do have wind, the wind increases the rate of spread if there's combustibles in the path. So the wind, you know, is really a terrible enemy here for us in the Bay Area. It's been, you know, terrible for Southern California, and so they've had to totally reconfigure, you know, their landscape because of the wind. And now it seems that it's becoming a problem here as well. Diablo winds are more frequent. So I
Well,
think,
just the number of red flag days that we're
Right.
getting each year
Yes.
now compared to 10, 20 years ago when all of these conditions are in alignment. It's, you know, they've increased quite a bit.
right. So Deborah Bourne, she just direct texted me during the presentation, and I think she has a really great suggestion. The diagrams in Rusty's presentation about the radiant heat exchange between structures, we're updating Living with Fire right now, is that we should put something like that in there depicting that. So Rusty, we might want to borrow 1 or 2 of those slides for Living with Fire.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, this your slides on radiant heat are really great. You know, you don't really think of that. You just think structure to structure ignition, but you get to the why is it structure to structure ignition, and the fact that radiant heat can penetrate into what it is touching or what it's heating up. That's why it's so important to have whatever you're building your house with, to have it be as ignition resistant as possible, to have a high rate of a high temperature of ignition. So I think steel is like 1500 degrees Celsius, not that we can clad our houses with steel, but the difference between wood and an ignition resistant product like either stucco or hardy board or something like that is really important, because when the radiant heat is there from, you know, say a structure on your own property, it could be your detached garage or your ADU or whatever is there, or even a burning tree, that radiant heat is absorbed by your house and there is an auto ignition point. And so I think it's important that we start thinking about what we're putting on our houses and what is the auto ignition temperature.
Yeah, I think it is extraordinarily important. It's extraordinarily complex and not yet sufficient investigation or learning has gone into getting to reliable guidelines for how to deal with this, because one of the points that you're making, Denise, about the when radiant heat strikes the surface, that radiant energy can be reflected, it can be diffused, it can be absorbed, or it can be re-radiated. So all of those things happen, and what of those things happen will vary from material to material. Has anybody looked at that and done those studies to figure that out? No, we don't. And this is what I'm talking about. if you take Apple and the investment they're putting into heat protecting their devices and compare it to the investment we put into heat protecting our homes in our communities, our neighborhoods, it's laughable. We don't do anything like this. And yet we are putting inside of these homes far more valuable assets. And we are jeopardizing so much more. And yet we don't have the knowledge or the information to design reliably what we're building. So that when that heat hits that surface, it's going to pass in either through penetration of the electromagnetic wave, because it's a shortwave radiation, or it's going to pass by conduction. Both forces are at play on that surface, both conduction and radiation. And once you've hit the surface, conduction moves, depending upon the material, rapidly or slowly, diffusely or directly. It all depends on the layers of materials that you have behind that surface. How thick is that surface? What is its heat capacity? And so there's so much for us to learn here.
Right. No, well, you guys have both really outlined it in a really, I mean, it's very easy to understand. It's very specific. And I think you guys are getting to the core of the issues for our homes and also our fuel reduction projects in our canyons. And I think everybody in the Bay Area who's listening to this call can take something away in terms of vegetation treatment and what the box canyons really mean for us and what the radiation from neighborhood structures present. So we're kind of out of time, but this has been a great presentation, and I want to thank you both for spending your time and working on the slides to make them ready for us, and we really appreciate it, and we will be posting it to our website, and really appreciate all your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.